Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The girl, whose name is Lelia was in the palace and was tidying up. She was very beautiful and soon came into her husband's office to help him get ready as well. As she put on his jacket, immediately inquired when he was coming home, but the man, glancing at her, replied that it would certainly not be that day. After that, he sighed heavily and said that she definitely might not be expecting him anytime soon. Lelia was of course upset at the way he was treating her coldly, but she didn't show it, and smiling said she understood. She also added that she would then expect him to return as soon as possible. She then went outside to escort him. When he took a few steps forward and saw her following him, he immediately inquired what it was that she suddenly wanted. The girl came close to him and said in a sad voice that she wanted to see him off, for he would be gone for a long time. But her husband replied that there was no need for that. He had already told her not to leave the tower. She lowered her head and said that he was right, and that she had just gotten carried away. So, as she walked back to the threshold, she curtsied and wished her husband Anbert a happy journey. In fact, 3 months ago, she married a king named Manwha Ricardo and eventually became queen. But in fact, she was only queen by title. She was left in the same tower, and Anber never even allowed her to leave it. So Lelia was already starting to think that he probably already hated her. Yes, and the servants are not often in this manner. As soon as they finish their work and cleaning and cooking, they go straight back to the main palace. She walked back to the manor and wondered why Anber had chosen her as his consort. As she walked along, she happened to see a small piece of jewelry. So Lelia assumed that he had dropped it accidentally. She stood up immediately and thought that her husband would probably be very worried when he noticed that the pendant was missing. So she decided to take it to him on her own to make sure he didn't have to worry about it all this time. And before long she was packed up and out. No doubt he had ordered her not to leave the tower ever. However, this pendant had the emblem of the royal family on it, so she knew it was something very important. Lelia felt that she did not need to meet him in person at all, but that it would be enough to simply hand the pendant to a trusted person. And then suddenly, when she was already inside the palace, she was approached from behind by some woman who addressed her. When she saw Lelia, she immediately said with a smile on her face that it was indeed her. The woman was Maria, the princess of the kingdom of Alta. Mary moved closer to the queen, and behind her remained standing a few guards who accompanied her everywhere. She, smiling, immediately congratulated Lelia on her wedding and also apologized for such a late congratulation, but they were, after all, only now able to meet. The girl was a little surprised at such an unexpected meeting, but thanked her profusely for her congratulations. Then Maria added that she had been looking for her for a long time because they had something to talk about. Lelia was immediately interested and asked what she wanted to talk about, and the princess replied that she was in love with Anber. And when Lelia heard this, she was so surprised that she could not even say a word. Mary came closer to her and said that he had told her that he regretted marrying her, and that was why he had locked her up in that backwater old tower that no one was allowed to enter. Then, with a smile on her face, she asked if she remembered correctly that he hadn't even spent his wedding night with her properly, and then explained that on that day, instead of being near his lawful wedded wife, he was in Mary's bed. When Lelia heard this, the whole even began to tremble from the emotions that swept over her. The girl did not understand what this princess was even talking about, because she had always trusted her spouse. But Mary, with her hands folded across her chest, said that she knew all about Anber, for she was his mistress. If it were not for the queen, it would be her who would take the title. She said that Anber had promised her that when they were in the same bed one night. Lelia just didn't want to believe it all, for it was too painful for her. Even though the man had never paid attention to her and had locked her in the tower, she still felt something for him. At this point, Mary suddenly pulled out her dagger and said that if she hadn't been there, she would have been queen long ago. The girl, when she saw this, was immediately frightened. She began to step back and asked that she should not do so. But Princess Mary was much faster. She pounced on the poor girl with a knife and stuck it right in her stomach, telling her to die for the happiness of her husband and mistress. When Lelia fell to the ground, she couldn't even cry because of the intense pain. She just held on to her bloody wound. And Mary, in turn, asked that the girl not be so angry with her, for now that she would be dead, Amber would always belong only to her, and she was very grateful for that. Lelia remained lying on the floor, bleeding. She was having trouble breathing and asked for someone to help her, but of course there was no one around. And the mistress at that moment threw a cloak over her face so that no one would see her, and quickly began to leave. The girl had never really trusted Amber to the very end. Next to him, everything seemed completely wrong. After the wedding, he just took her and locked her in a tower with no family or friends, left her alone on their wedding night. And that night was important to both of them, because they were now legally married. But he had just left for someone else. Lelia began to cry and thought that this was probably how she was destined to die all alone at the hands of her husband's mistress. Shortly thereafter, it began to rain outside. Amber found her, and taking her in his arms, began to lead her away. The girl was already almost completely unconscious, her vitals running low. But when she felt someone take her in their arms, she thought about it being Amber without opening her eyes, but then realized that was simply impossible. She was well aware that their marriage was merely politically advantageous to them, and her love was only one-sided. But she was incredibly warm and cozy to stay in her fantasies, where he loved her too, and they were always together. When Lelia was on the verge of death, she thought to herself that if their marriage was destined to end this way, she had better never marry him. At that moment, some of her tears started to fall on the barrette that hung in her hair, and the girl thought about how she wished she could start all over again and not make the same mistakes. Soon afterward, she closed her eyes permanently, and after that, she suddenly began to hear someone calling her remotely. When Lelia woke up, she saw some guy next to her. He kept saying her name. When she looked closer, she realized it was her older brother. He looked worried and asked if she was all right. Lelia looked around and noticed that she was in a wagon and didn't realize what had happened at all. Her older brother wondered if she was having a nightmare. He liked to ask her about such things and wanted to know all the details. And her father said that if anything, she could sleep a little longer, since they still had time before the parade. When Lelia heard all this, she was incredibly surprised and confused. She didn't understand what was going on, so she looked out the window, and as she saw her reflection in it, she noticed the outfit she was wearing, and she remembered the dress perfectly. She had worn it to Amber's 19th birthday parade. Suddenly, the mother turned to her. The girl immediately turned in her direction, and the woman said that she had noticed that she had decided to wear it after all. Lelia didn't immediately understand what she was talking about, but then suddenly remembered the blue brooch that hung on her chest and was completely out of the color scheme of her outfit. When she wanted to answer her mother, their carriage suddenly hit a rock, and the girl was shaken inside the carriage. Because the brooch wasn't attached too well, it bounced off her dress and started flying off somewhere to the side. Lelia was very scared because of this, so she immediately ran to grab it, and she still managed to keep the brooch from getting lost and falling outside the wagon. She held it close to her, and remembered that the carriage had started to shake that day, and she had dropped the thing. Then the brooch cracked. But this jewelry was very precious to Lelia, and she even tried to fix it herself once. And then suddenly the girl, remembering all similar events, could not believe that she had somehow traveled back in time. But then, after looking at this brooch closer, suggested that it could probably just be a realistic nightmare due to severe blood loss. But as it was, Lelia needed to get a full understanding of the situation first. She heard her brother speaking to her, asking if she was all right. She turned to him and said she was fine. She thought the clasp was just loose on the brooch, and also added that she wouldn't wear it that day, so she wouldn't lose it permanently. Soon afterward, they began already to drive into the town, in which many different people were crowded together. They were all looking at the carriage as it passed by. When they arrived at the venue, she and her mother came out first, and the woman asked that Lelia present the bouquet to Mr. Anber. Of course she wasn't very happy about it, but she said she would do it. In fact, everything was going exactly as the girl remembered it. Therefore, Lelia concluded that she had indeed found herself in the past. If it had been just a bad dream, the events would have been described differently. Shortly afterwards, another carriage arrived, from which Mr. Anber himself emerged directly. He looked handsome and confident. He walked straight over to the family and stood right in front of Lelia. The girl stared at him in surprise for a while. She couldn't even say anything, for she had forgotten what he looked like before. But then suddenly, Anber stepped closer to her and smiled, never taking his eyes off her. The girl began to feel very awkward. She didn't understand why he was looking at her with such a tender gaze, and because of that she looked somewhere to the side. In fact, this man Lelia knew was quite different. Suddenly her mother came up behind her and whispered to her daughter. The woman told her to keep her mind on what she had to do, so Lelia immediately handed him a bouquet of flowers and wished Prince Anber a happy birthday. The guy waved his head, smiled, and accepted the bouquet of flowers from her and thanked her for it. Lelia couldn't take her eyes off him and didn't understand why he looked so kind, because even in his past life he had already been displeased. She knew perfectly well that he must hate her at first sight, and she knew she could never have liked him. Soon afterward, the celebration finally began. All the guests moved into the huge dance hall, the music started playing, and the young people began to party. After a parade in his honor, they were able to meet at a ball given by the new king, and even in his past life, he was able to instantly steal Lilia's fragile heart. That in her past life, and in this life, she was amazed at what he was like and couldn't contain her emotions. So the girl even suggested that perhaps she was destined to fall in love with him. After the ball, she received a letter from him and couldn't believe it, that Anber had proposed her engagement. The girl was beyond delighted and embarrassed. He had chosen her after one single dance, and she was amazed at it. Of course, Lelia was well aware that it had to be a marriage of convenience, but still, she rejoiced at the mere possibility of even seeing him one more time. However, even though she did become queen, she was deprived of her first legal wedding night and ended up being murdered by her husband's mistress. Throughout their married life, Anber had never once smiled at her or said a nice word to her, as a spouse was supposed to do. They hardly ever spoke. He was always off somewhere, not showing up at her castle for weeks, sometimes even months. The moment Lelia handed him a bouquet of flowers, he pulled out one beautiful flower and tucked it, along with her hair, behind her ear. It made the girl feel incredibly pleased, but at the same time surprised. She immediately looked up at him to realize what was going on. Anber, for his part, looked at her without taking his eyes off her and smiled slightly, as if he really liked her. After being silent for a while, he thanked her for such a beautiful bouquet and also said that he really hoped she could enjoy the parade. Lily looked away from him. She did not want to look him in the eye, for she realized that perhaps those feelings might flare up in her again. So she only thanked him for that and said that, of course, the parade would be a good one. Soon after the event was over, many people dispersed to their homes, and some went to the palace to attend the ball. Lily and her family got into the wagon and set off. The mother turned to her husband and said that everything had gone just fine. She had not expected to see such a scale. Lily, for her part, was sitting by the window, wondering why he was smiling so gently at her. The girl suggested that perhaps all those events she had lived through before were just a terrible dream. She supposed that if all this was really true, it was a pretty realistic yet horrible dream. But at that moment, the carriage suddenly hit another rock, and because of that, everyone inside started to shake violently. Lily hit her head very hard, but in fact that rock even caused the carriage wheel to fall off altogether. It even ended up breaking windows because of all this, and after that my brother was left with a limp for the rest of his life. He needed a wheelchair. And just when it was about to happen in her new life, Mother suddenly saw her worried face and asked if she was all right. The girl knew at once that what was then about to happen, and indeed it did, the wheel of the carriage began to fall off. So Lelia turned to her whole family and asked that they all duck down urgently. She immediately pulled the blanket off the seats and covered them all with it. But then, suddenly, when she felt the shaking stop, the girl looked out from under the covers and noticed that the window was completely intact. Lelia was very surprised and didn't understand how this could happen, since it was already over and there wasn't a single crack on it. Soon afterward, the wagon was stopped and the whole family got out. The man immediately went to deal with the coachman and asked what had happened. The wagoner replied that he thought a wheel had fallen off on the carriage, and also asked the gentleman if they were injured. The man exhaled a sigh of relief and said that no one was actually hurt, and it was all thanks to Lilia's smarts. The brother moved closer to his sister and hugged her with joy, and told her that they had been saved after all. In fact, he was really scared for his life, just like everyone else. Shortly afterward, they went back home and did not go to the celebration again. When the girl was in her room, she immediately began to examine the brooch. Lelia noticed that she was completely unharmed, but that was very surprising. The girl remembered very well all the events that were to take place on the way to the parade. She had broken a brooch dear to her, and also, when they were returning home, their carriage had broken down and her brother had injured his legs. However, this time none of the above happened at all. But then suddenly Lelia wondered why it might not have happened, and suggested that perhaps she had prevented it in some way. She remembered how the brooch had flown out of her hands, and how then she had longed very much to catch it. The girl decided to test one of her theories, so she picked up a vase of flowers that stood next to her on the table. She stepped aside and immediately let it slip out of her hands. Before the vase hit the ground and shattered, she immediately shouted out for it to stop, and it did indeed happen. The vase froze in midair, as if it were paused. Lelia just couldn't believe her eyes. Then she decided to check it again. She took the vase in her hands and threw it again, but this time she didn't say anything. In the end, the vase just fell to the ground and shattered badly. The girl was confused. She couldn't understand why she couldn't succeed this time, and she suddenly felt sick, and it felt as if her head was about to split open like this vase. Suddenly, blood started dripping from her nose. The girl looked at her hand in surprise and was horrified. She didn't understand what was happening. And so a whole 3 days had passed since then, and she had been able to realize something in all that time. Lelia has developed some kind of superpower, stopping time for literally 3 seconds at a time. So one morning at breakfast, when the maid dropped the teapot, the girl was able to stop time and pick it up, and afterward held it out to the girl. A girl can only use this power 3 times per day, and if she exceeds this limit, her body is drastically affected. Suddenly, her mother turned to her and asked Lelia if she was going to study all day again. The girl, who was drinking tea, replied that she was. She explained to her mom that she had just recently become interested in something and wanted to learn as much as she could about this field. Shortly afterward, she went to her office and gathered some papers. Lelia needed to learn as much as she could about her ability so she could use it to her advantage in the future. She wondered what she could even use this power on. So after scattering the papers, she immediately stopped them in midair. And all the while, the very brooch was beside the girl, and Lelia kept wondering how she could extend the stoppage of time. In fact, in her previous life, when her engagement to Amber was announced, her family had been much happier for herself. Lelia couldn't tell them about being put in the tower. As a result, her husband did not want to be around her at all. She suddenly became sad, thinking that if the news of her death spread, surely her mother, father, and brother would be very sad. Then suddenly the girl thought about what she could do in this life and decided to use her special abilities to change it for the better. She was going to never have anything to do with Amber Ricardo again. After a few more days, the girl practiced in the morning in her room. She picked up a bouquet of flowers and held it in the air. Thanks to her constant practicing, she was now able to hold him off for a full 10 minutes. And since then, all year long, she had been practicing with stopping time. Now she could stop it for quite a long time. From 3 seconds and as much as 10 minutes. That was quite a bit of progress because she'd been in pain from it before. However, her limit hadn't increased at all. As before, she could only stop time 3 times a day, and that made her a little sad. And it doesn't matter at all anymore whether she stops him for a second or a few minutes. Even that time is not enough time for the meeting with Amber to fail. Suddenly, there was a knock at her door. It was a maid. She came into the room, bowed, and told Lily that it was time for them to go. The girl smiled and said she was ready. Then she took a seat at the dressing table, and the maids began to tidy her hair. The time had come for her to go to the very ball that had been organized by Amber. The king had passed away a few months ago, and Amber had been proclaimed the new ruler of the empire. So this was his first ball as the new king. Officially, the ball was given in honor of the coronation, but in reality, the young king was looking for a consort. Undoubtedly, every girl wished to become his queen. It is not only the possession of such a handsome man beside you, but also a rather significant title. And in the end, of all the ladies at the ball, he chose Lily not only to dance with, but to marry. Initially, Lily didn't want to attend this ball, but all the noble ladies of the kingdom were invited, so she simply had no choice. As expected, attendance was mandatory, but the girl figured that if Amber didn't ask her to dance at this ball, their marriage would never happen. With her superpower, the girl should be able to do well. Even though she was a little uncomfortable, she still believed in her powers. Soon afterward, the maids came to her. When they had finished tidying up her hair and made it very pretty, they said it was done and she could get dressed. Lelia did so at once. When she put on her beautiful blue dress with blue tones, the maids began to applaud and said that she was simply gorgeous. Lelia thanked them, and she was a little embarrassed, but she realized that this dress really suited her very well. Then the maid came to her, bringing her box of various jewelry, and inquired what accessories she wished to wear. Lelia searched for what she needed for a while, and soon found a blue butterfly and said she wanted to wear it. The maid immediately took it in her hands, and when she wanted to put it on her mistress, she apologized and said that the clasp was loose so that it might fall out during the dance. Lelia said she didn't mind, so she'd pick something else, since there was nothing else she could do, and soon she was wearing another piece of jewelry. It wasn't until closer to evening that she reached her destination. There were people already dancing and partying, some drinking, talking, and discussing the hot topics of society. As soon as the girl walked in, she immediately smelled the pleasant flavors of the appetizers and also heard an incredibly beautiful melody. But she couldn't enjoy this evening, for she kept looking all the time to see where Amber was. And soon with a glance she finally found him. He was sitting on his throne in the middle of the hall, watching the people dancing. The girl hid from him behind a column and immediately began to think out her plan in her head. She must watch him closely, and if he starts suddenly approaching her, she's going to stop time around him and run away somewhere far away. Her maximum was only 10 minutes, and she figured that would be long enough to get away to the other side of the hall. The girl stood enjoying the music for a while longer, when suddenly she saw Amber get up from his seat and start heading somewhere. She was immediately frightened, so she hid behind a column. The girl tried to calm herself down, saying that everything was fine, she just needed to survive the night, and then she would change her life. Lelia stood motionless for a while, then started looking to see where Amber was going. The man was walking among the girls who were crowded around him. He walked rather slowly and kept turning his head to the side, so Lelia immediately wondered who he was looking for in the first place. But then she suddenly remembered that this wasn't just a ball in honor of his coronation, and assumed that he was looking for a potential bride. She remembered what had happened in her past life and realized that it had been with the simplest of coincidences before they met. They had simply crossed glances. And this time the man suddenly started looking in her direction. Lelia, when she saw this, immediately hid behind a column and began to worry very much. She realized that things were completely bad for her. In fact, she was so surprised that she involuntarily stopped time. So while everyone around her stood, the girl immediately started walking away in the other direction. It didn't matter to her at all that she did it by accident, because she needed to stay as far away from Amber as possible anyway. She decided that she could stop time just one more time, and it might very well be good for her. When it was over, the man looked around, not realizing what had even happened, for he had some strange feelings afterward. Lelia was already at the end of the hall and hid behind the curtain. She thought about the fact that no one would ever find her in this place. Then she began to glide her gaze over all the people to find Amber and see how far away he even was. But at that moment, a male voice addressed her, asking if she was looking for someone. When the girl turned her head to the side, she saw him right in front of her. Lelia was incredibly surprised. She immediately replied in a shaky voice that she had done nothing of the sort, and he said, smiling, that he was very glad to hear it. Afterward, bowing, he extended his hand to her and inquired if she would allow him to ask her to dance. Lelia stood there and remained silent for a while. She was well aware that she had been invited by the king himself, so she certainly couldn't refuse. So putting her hand in his, she said in a trembling voice that she was honored. After that, they went straight to the middle of the hall to dance. At this very time, Maria was hiding behind the columns not far away from all this and watching them angrily. She was very annoyed at what was happening. As Lelia danced along with the man, all she could think about was her urgent need to stop time and escape as soon as possible. But she couldn't figure out how he could find her, since she was pretty well hidden. And he couldn't see her while time was running out. Then Lelia thought that maybe the future couldn't be changed after all, and it was just her destiny. As they twirled in the dance, Amber turned to the girl and wondered if she didn't like dancing that much. She said in a trembling voice that she was not at all. She was just very nervous after all. She was dancing with the king, and that was quite important. Hearing this, he was a little surprised and sighed heavily, for it was also hard for him to be in the role of a king. Then he put her hand to his chest and wondered why she was so worried, since she moved very perfectly anyway. Lelia, smiling her beautiful and dazzling smile, thanked him for this nice compliment. And the man, as soon as he looked at her, immediately felt many different mixed feelings inside him and asked if they could talk privately after the dance. When Lily heard this, she was very worried, but of course, because he was the king, she could not refuse him, so she agreed to the proposal. When they finished dancing, it was quite dark outside. They went outside and went into the garden. There was a small gazebo there. She immediately wondered if Amber had invited her to a conversation like this in a past life, because she didn't remember it for some reason. The man was standing not far from her and was holding a glass of alcohol and asked if she would like to have a little drink. Lelia stepped closer to him and said she would be only too happy to do so. But she didn't drink alcohol, of course. The man said that of course he understood perfectly well. So handing her the glass, he said it was fruit juice. She immediately took it in her hands and thanked the man for it. Afterward, she inquired what it was that he wanted to talk to her about so urgently after all. Amber replied that it wasn't really anything that serious. He just wanted to be near her more, that's all. And she was a little surprised at such words, but said nothing. Then the man moved closer to her and asked if she had a loved one. Lelia immediately wondered who her favorite person could be. Of course, he was the only one that came to her mind. Even though he had hurt her in her past life, she considered him her greatest love. But after being silent for a while, she looked away from him and wondered in a trembling voice why it was he who was suddenly asking her about it. Amber, smiling her beautiful, perfect smile, said that during the dance he just felt like there was someone special in her heart. When she heard that, she immediately blushed and blurted out sharply and loudly that she certainly didn't have anyone like that. Then the man laughed and covered his mouth with his hand so she wouldn't think he was mocking her. When Lelia noticed this, she was very surprised, for she had never before seen him smile a genuine smile. Then out of politeness, she immediately inquired, what if His Highness had a similar person? Her hands immediately began to tremble, and she tried to make it not be seen. Then Amber, looking somewhere in the distance, said in a cryptic voice that he actually had such a person and could only think of her. When Lelia heard this, she was stunned, but at that moment she could even remember that while they were a couple, he hardly spoke to her. Dinner, breakfast, and lunch, when it happened together, they were just silent. His thoughts were always somewhere very far away at times like this, and when their gazes briefly met, he quickly tried to look away. Perhaps if they had lived in the same house, she would have realized sooner that his thoughts were occupied with an entirely different person. That is why, as Lelia now guessed, she is locked alone in the tower and forbidden to leave. Amber wanted her to stay out of his way to have fun with Maria and maybe even other girls. Then the girl came to the conclusion that he had always thought only of her, but still she did not understand why in that case he had married Lelia. If Maria was also from a rather noble family, and he could have chosen her. Then the man suddenly noticed that Lily was uncomfortable and trembling. He looked at her in surprise and wanted to ask her something, but at that moment he was interrupted. It was the voice of a man who came toward them. He apologized to His Majesty and said that he had been able to find him at last. Amber immediately looked in his direction and wondered if something was wrong. He immediately became very serious. The man was Duke Snow, and he was Amber's closest aide. The man bowed and said that someone wished to speak to him. Amber looked at him in surprise, wondering if there really was someone who needed him so urgently. Snow replied that everything was absolutely correct. Princess Maria of the Kingdom of Alta insists on an immediate meeting. When Lelia heard the name, she was immediately interested, and the man replied that in that case, he would be here very soon. When the aide left, Amber turned to Lady Harren and apologized for having to leave her. He said there were people he still had much to discuss with, so unfortunately, he must leave their pleasant conversation. Lelia, smiling, replied that of course she understood everything perfectly well, so he need not worry. The man immediately turned around and started walking away, leaving her completely alone. But at that moment, Mary suddenly came up to him and taking him under the arm said hello. Amber immediately looked very serious and said that the girl didn't have to come to him at all. But Maria, smiling, said that she wanted to see him as soon as possible. She then glimpsed back to where Lelia was standing and smiled evilly. And when the girl saw it, she immediately realized that even at that time, he had already betrayed her. And she, because she was blinded by naive love, did not even notice it all. Immediately afterward, the girl returned to the ballroom and tried to reassure herself, talking about how this was even great. Well, Lelia has absolutely no obligation to marry him, and in this life the future has already begun to change, so she can move on with her life in peace. The girl also looked at her hand and thought about the fact that she also had a special power, so under no circumstances would she marry Amber. Soon afterward, the ball was over and everyone went home. The man went to his small annex. The butler came up to him and, serving him tea, said he was very glad to have him back. Then, Snow came into his office and wondered if he might be better off resting this evening, for the ball was over and he did not have to get down to business right away. Amber stared at his reflection in the cup of tea for a while, pondering what he should do. Afterward, he told the boy that he was right. The Duke said that he thought he had had a pretty good time at the event. The man looked at him in surprise and asked why he had suddenly come to that conclusion. He explained that he had only organized the ball because he had to. If he hadn't become king, he would have been happy to just sit in his office and do business. Snow bowed and said that he just thought Amber had enjoyed dancing with that beautiful lady. That's why he assumed he had a good time. The man tried to hide his smile with his hand when he heard those words and immediately thought about Lily. This girl had told him that there was no one in her heart. However, he wasn't sure if that was really true. The Duke continued to insist and asked, did this really mean that Lady Harren would be the next queen? Amber got very angry at this question and immediately started shouting at him. But the boy bowed and said that he understood and would not insist on asking any more questions. Then the king inquired if it was true that the Duke's daughter already had a fiancé or partner. But his assistant said that this was absolutely not true. She had no one at the moment. The man was a little surprised by this, but said that it was clear to him so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion. He thought of Mary, who had looked so angrily at Lelia, and then took up the letter. Having written it, he placed it in an envelope and requested that an assistant take this engagement proposal to the Duke of Harren's estate and deliver it personally to his daughter. When Snow heard this, he was very surprised and asked if he was really ready to propose an engagement to a lady he had only danced with once. He said he had certainly envisioned her becoming the next queen. However, he believes the man was a bit hasty. Amber sat back in his seat and asked him to be honest. Was he not satisfied with something? The aide replied that of course he had no right to decide, but he still asked why he had decided so quickly. The man was unwilling to answer this question, so, changing the subject of conversation, said that no one should know about it in the letter, and requested that he should deliver it personally into the girl's hands and tell her to keep the letter with her at all times. Snow did not question him further about anything, but merely bowed and said that he would fulfill everything, and then went out of the door. Amber immediately wondered if the girl would be asking the same questions as his assistant. However, he decided that it was no longer important. At the same moment, the maid, who was standing on the other side of the door and eavesdropping on this entire conversation, was incredibly surprised at what she heard. Snow went at once to the stable. The man in charge was surprised to see him and asked him why he needed a horse so late. The man didn't say anything back to him. Then the guy, opening the gate, only wished him to be careful on the roads. At that moment, a maid suddenly ran straight at him. She shoved him in the shoulder so hard that he dropped the letter to the floor. The girl immediately began to apologize to him and screamed loudly, pretending to be very ashamed. But Snow replied that there was nothing wrong with that. It was his own fault for not looking around, and they had run into each other like that. The maid bent down at that moment to pick up the letter. While she was doing so, she noticed that the letter was addressed to Lelia Heron, the Duke's daughter. She immediately smiled and handed it to the man, saying that she had scolded and had memorized the name herself. Snow thanked her for that, then wondered what she was doing in the stable in the middle of the night. The maid immediately replied that she had just seen one of the horses unwell in the morning and was so worried that she had decided to check on her. The man did not suspect anything and said that she was a very kind soul. Then, smiling, she told the man that he must be in a great hurry and wished him to be more careful on his way. Snow replied that this was all perfectly true. Then the maid went away, leaving him alone. He had some suspicions about her, for she was acting suspiciously and strangely. But he realized that he was thinking too much, for he had to deliver this letter immediately, without any distractions. At this moment, the maid, when she ran out of the stables, immediately headed into the forest. There, she sped up and thought that she needed to report this incident to Princess Mary as soon as possible. At dawn, a maid came to Lelia and told her that a guest had arrived. She was very surprised to hear this and immediately asked who it was. The maid replied that he had come from the palace and said he had an urgent message to deliver to his personal young mistress. When the girl heard it, she immediately realized what content it had, but she said that she didn't mind, and also asked for the girls to help her pack. She also told one of the maids to take the guest to the parlor, and also told him that she would come over as soon as she was dressed. One of them went there, and another was summoned to help, for the dress was rather difficult for one maid to put on. In fact, Lily was a little worried because in her previous life something like this had happened. A messenger from the palace had arrived suddenly, but that time it was to her father, not to her. Later, her father called her to his house and informed her that Amber was proposing an engagement, and she received the letter already in person. Soon after Lelia got ready, she went straight down to the living room, where a man was already waiting for her. As soon as Snow saw her, he immediately bowed and thanked her for accepting him despite the sudden visit. The girl said he shouldn't thank her since she hadn't done anything wrong and thanked him for waiting. She curtsied in greeting. The man then handed her the letter and said that His Majesty had asked that it be given to her personally for her. Lily was very surprised, but she took the letter in her hands and thanked him for it. Then she concluded that this was it, because it looked familiar. It was exactly the same as she had received from her father in a previous life, but she decided it wasn't worth judging ahead of time, so she immediately opened it up and started reading. And as soon as Lelia read that he wanted to arrange an engagement, She even blushed. She reread the same line several times, trying to figure out if it was true. The man, seeing that she had already read it and smiling, said that also His Majesty had asked her to tell him to keep this letter to herself only, and not to tell anyone. Lelia said that she understood everything, but she was incredibly surprised and even frightened. Her whole body was shaking. When Snow noticed this, he noticed that she also looked very pale, so he inquired if she was definitely all right, and also asked if she happened to be unwell. Lelia put on a false smile and said that she was actually fine. She was just a little surprised. Then, lowering her gaze, she apologized and wondered if she could think a little about answering this letter. The man said that of course she had the right to do so, and also added that he would pass it on to His Highness. The girl also added that she would definitely send them a reply. Snow said with a smile that he would expect a reply in that case, and he thought about Lady Heron looking very upset, so he didn't know if he should tell His Highness. But he came to the conclusion that there was absolutely no need for it, for she would accept the engagement proposal anyway. After all, nothing is more attractive than marrying royalty. Immediately afterward, he ran outside and got back on his horse and rode to his king in order to convey to him the answer from the girl. Lelia went to her room after that and realized that Amber hadn't given up on the idea of asking her for an engagement after all. That time, she had been incredibly happy when she heard the news, but now all she could do was not understand why there was no way she could change her future. But more than anything, Lelia didn't want to be betrayed and hurt again. She didn't want to die alone at the hands of her lover. Suddenly, someone knocked on her door. It was her older brother. When he came inside, he said that he had heard that someone from the castle had come to see her. He immediately moved closer to her, and seeing her sad expression, wondered if something had happened. Lelia, hiding the letter behind her back, said that it was correct. His Majesty had written that he had been very glad to dance with her and was grateful for that evening. His brother immediately exhaled in relief and said that he had never once doubted his little sister and that she would be able to impress even the king himself. Lelia felt a little sad to keep quiet about it and deceive them. However, she was well aware that her relatives must not find out about it, but she didn't even know what she should do in the end with this letter. Some time passed since then, and Snow finally did return to the king's estate. He immediately told the man about everything, and he has been checking all the letters very carefully ever since. And when the assistant handed him the letters again, Amber, looking them over carefully, was very disappointed, for the consent to the engagement was not there again. This made him very angry. The aide bowed and said that Lady Heron had said she would be sure to send a reply, so all they had to do was wait. He also asked if the king thought she should not be rushed. The man replied that he did not think she should be hurried, but that he would go and speak to her personally, and added that if he took a horse now, he could reach her by lunchtime. Snow immediately went after him and began to indignantly say that the man was just in too much of a hurry, because this way he would only intimidate her more, and she might refuse to even think about agreeing. Amber looked at him angrily and said that he knew too much, and added that it looked very suspicious and asked him what he was hiding. Lelia at this moment went out onto the veranda to get some fresh air and didn't know what she should do now. The letter had already been received, which meant that she had to give some kind of answer. It had been 2 whole days since that moment. She realized she shouldn't give him a curt rejection, but she didn't understand why Amber was in such a hurry to get engaged, even in this life. But if she turned him down, it could hurt her family very badly. After all, she'd have to talk to her father about the case, as much as she didn't want to do that. By then, Amber had already arrived at her manor. When he looked up, he saw the girl, and Lily, who had heard some noises, saw him as well. For a while they looked at each other, and afterward the girl, shrieking, turned at once to him. Lelia, seeing him in front of her in person, was very startled and surprised. She wondered what he was even doing in this place. The man, bowing, got off his horse and said he had come to find out the answer to his proposal. He replied that he had been trying to find the rumor all this time, but no one was around, and while he was looking, he even ended up bumping into her himself. Lelia immediately replied that she was sorry that her answer was so much delayed that he had even come to see her. Then the man interrupted her and immediately asked her if he was bothering her so much. She looked at him in surprise and asked him what he meant by that. The king said he meant the engagement and wondered if she thought he was in too much of a hurry. Lily continued to stare at him in surprise. She was getting nervous, so her whole body was shaking. She asked why he'd chosen her, since they'd only danced once. Amber stared at her for a while, and then turned away, wondering if he was bothering her that much. She answered nothing to this. Then the man, looking at her again, said that the messenger who had given her the letter had said that she was greatly surprised at such contents. He also added that if she really has a man she wants to marry, she can refuse this engagement. He understands everything perfectly well. Lelia, when she heard this, was very surprised and asked if it was really true. When Amber heard that, he was a little upset even, and afterward he smiled and said that he didn't think he was that disgusted with her. The girl at that moment immediately realized that she had been too emotional, so she had offended him with her words, but she didn't want to be so harsh. She realized that she had acted too stupidly, so she needed to rectify the situation somehow. But the man, when he saw her worried face, told her not to worry. He wasn't going to force her to be queen. He smiled and looked at her with an understanding look and said that he must have been hasty after all when he proposed to her after the first dance, and thus frightened her. When Lily saw him in his distressed state, she was surprised, for she had never known him to have such an expression. She had never seen it from him before. The man was silent for a while, then asked if she could still hurry up with her refusal. Lily said more cautiously that it was possible. She had not thought that there were any definite rules for refusing an engagement. But the king also asked her to keep the letter to herself until she had made a final decision. The girl was a little surprised at this request, but said she would do as he wished. Amber, turning around, apologized to her for the sudden visit, and also told her he had to go now. When he stepped away from her, he was at once very sad, for he did not think she could say such a thing to him. And Lelia, as she looked at him, thought that she might give up the engagement after all. The man's visit had certainly surprised her, but now she realized that she could really change her future. At that moment, her older brother suddenly came out onto the veranda and immediately turned to her. He was very serious, and coming close to his sister, inquired if it was His Majesty just now. Lily wanted to say something, but she didn't know what to do. So soon they sat down on the veranda, and she explained everything to him. The girl even showed him the letter, and the elder brother was very surprised that the king had proposed an engagement to her. Lelia, in her defense, said that he also said she could say no, and her brother inquired when it all started. The girl replied that the letter from the palace was about the engagement. Lelia said not at all, and apologizing said she was well aware that the connection with the palace was always useful, and she had been rather selfish. But the guy, smiling, took her by the shoulder and said he didn't blame her at all. He just didn't want her to marry out of love. He said he wants her to be truly happy, and he's sure her parents think the same way. So if she doesn't love the king, it's completely irrelevant that these ties could be good for their family. Then he took the letter in his hands and asked that they keep it secret for the time being, for His Majesty did not mind the refusal, and in his opinion it was best not to bring it out in public. The parents need not worry. Lelia said with a smile that he was absolutely right, and she herself was incredibly glad that her brother was really on her side. Her heart was immediately at peace. She couldn't believe that he had actually taken her position, and she also decided that she should have consulted him from the beginning. Then everything would have changed a long time ago. And so a few days had passed since then, and suddenly Maria arrived at Leila's house for tea. The girl sat across from her and looked at Princess Mary in surprise, not understanding what she was doing in her room. The girl in turn smiled and turned to Lady Heron and said that this was their first meeting. She was, however, very glad to have been able to receive her. Lilia said with a smile that she shouldn't be so grateful. And Maria picked up the envelope and handed it to the palace coma, saying that the girl shouldn't worry so much because everything would be fine. After Lilia saw it, she was very surprised. She was about to say something when suddenly Maria moved closer to her and asked, "Does that mean she is already aware of it?" And afterward, with a smile on her face, she said that Amber had proposed marriage to Maria. But then suddenly she also added that she had heard that the girl had also received this letter. That's why she had come to have a word with her about it. Lilia looked at the girl in surprise and didn't understand how this could be understood at all, and then assumed that Amber was okay with the rejection only because he still had a backup in the form of Maria. But the princess said she had a request to make, and also inquired if she could give up this engagement. Lilia, not thinking long, immediately said that she agreed. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is she really ready to give up?" She also asked if she even understood what she had said to her. Lilia, proudly raising her head, said that she hadn't planned to agree to this from the beginning, so she was going to say no. Maria, a little worried, but pulling a smile on her face, said she understood, and also added that she didn't know what was on her mind. However, she was glad that they wouldn't have to fight about it. She also added that you never know what can happen, which is why she even brought along a lawyer in case things go wrong. Lilia was silent for a while, and afterward asked the girl how she was even going to act in case she didn't agree. The girl, smiling, said that of course she would try to find a compromise. However, if the story started to drag on, she had plenty of other good methods. Lilia was astonished at this behavior of the girl and, lowering her head, said nothing. Seeing the expression on her face, Maria immediately wondered what the big deal was. After all, she was the Princess of Alta, and everyone would be better off if the two royal dynasties united. After calming down a bit, Lilia smiled at her and told her that she understood. She really agreed with her on that. She also said she was still going to back out of the engagement and added that she helped her solidify her decision in this way. When Mary heard this, she was very much surprised, and the girl confirmed it by saying that tomorrow she would write her answer to His Majesty at once. The girl, rising from her seat, said it was a great relief to her and added that Lady Harren was a pleasure to talk to. She then, taking her lawyer with her, walked out the door, saying she had to go now, thus leaving Lilia alone. The girl, however, insisted on her own and thought that even afterward, her feelings must not change. She must follow her plan. That evening, when the answer did come, Amber was sitting near the window in his fine and expensive chair with many empty liquor bottles beside him. The man was very upset and drank it all in one go. He had not expected that Lilia could refuse him. He had hoped to the very last that she would accept his proposal.